Once a stable and relatively safe country is now a shell of its former self. Yemen collapsed into poverty and violence almost a decade ago, when a devastating war broke out involving several international players. The UN estimates fatalities to be in the hundreds of thousands, and displacements in the millions. Survivors live in makeshift tent camps, which lack the most basic facilities.
The camps and the tents don't protect them from the cold weather. Now there is also the emergency shelter, which is made of wood, and along with the tents, it offers no protection against the cold.
Children suffer the most. The UN says more than 2 million Yemeni children are acutely malnourished. They're already vulnerable, making the cold potentially deadly.
We need blankets for the children because they have to live in this cold. They go to sleep at night and they don't come out until 10 in the morning due to the cold weather. It is freezing here.
This camp is home to a few hundred people. Its population keeps growing, but the amount of assistance available doesn't.
2 years ago, we received 500 winter aid bags, and this year we have only got 170 bags so far. Unfortunately, this winter there is no clear response regarding the winter bags for displaced people.
The cold is just the latest hardship to be faced by the people here.
There is very limited water in these tanks. Every day, people in one section fill up their containers, so it's a different group each day. I'm in the last group that gets to fill up, which means that 9 families are deprived of access to water today. We have to go to another area to get water. There's a well there that they sometimes allow us to use and sometimes don't.
Residents are pleading with international organizations to boost aid packages and give them a fighting chance at surviving winter. Malik Fouda, TRT World.
Latest news out of Yemen. Headliner: Biden's diplomacy in Yemen means taking Saudi Arabia's side and could spark all-out war. From The Intercept, dated January 1st, 2023. When Bernie Sanders called for a vote on a war powers resolution that would block U.S. support for the Saudi-led war effort in Yemen, the Biden administration immediately pushed back. The resolution, the White House warned, would upset diplomatic efforts and bring about the war it was trying to end. The administration strongly opposes the Yemen war powers resolution on a number of grounds, but the bottom line is that this resolution is unnecessary and would greatly complicate the intense and ongoing diplomacy to truly being an end to the conflict, read White House talking points, which were circulated privately. It also went on to say, in 2019, diplomacy was absent and the war was raging. This is not the case now. Thanks to our diplomacy, which remains ongoing and delicate, the violence over nearly 9 months has effectively stopped. The White House claims that its diplomacy is working, however, are undercut by its own political moves and the reality on the ground. President Joe Biden's envoy for the conflict has consistently sided with the Saudi coalition against the Houthi movement that controls much of the country. And through a ceasefire during the spring and summer, provided a respite in civilian casualties due to bombings, the ongoing Saudi blockade and economic warfare against Yemenis perpetrates the humanitarian crisis in the country, which the United Nations has deemed the worst in the world. Without taking an even-handed approach to the conflict in search of a political solution and the mitigation of the humanitarian crisis, the Biden administration's machinations can hardly be considered good faith efforts at diplomacy. Critics of U.S. policy in the conflict have said that there's been no diplomatic progress whatsoever, and that there's been no political process, no negotiations, or even a prospect of them, so an all-out war can resume at any time, according to Jamal Bomar, the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen. The divisions in Yemen, with the Saudi coalition controlling southern oil fields imports and the Houthi-led government controlling territory to the north that houses some 80% of the country's 30 million residents, are only growing more entrenched. Instead of asking concessions of its allies in the Saudi coalition The Biden administration's one-sidedness has contributed to the breakdown of diplomacy. Though violence has not returned to earlier levels since the expiration of the ceasefire in October of 2022, fighting continues along some of the war's front lines. The Houthis have warned that their restraint won't last long amid the current impasse and continued blockade of the fuel imports. If the embargo is not eased, they said, they will reciprocally blockade a nearby waterway crucial to the global oil markets. The situation is only growing more explosive. Headliner: more than 11,000 children killed or injured in Yemen conflict, says UNICEF. Dated December 11, 2022. From UN News. Agency Chief Catherine Russell, who has completed a visit to the country, called for urgent renewal of the truce between the government and Houthi rebels. The landmark agreement was initially announced in April and led to a significant reduction in the intensity of the conflict. However, a further 62 children have been killed or injured in the period since it ended in early October and November 30th, UNICEF has said. Furthermore, at least 74 children were among the 164 people killed or injured by landmines and unexploded ordnance between July and September alone, from Saudi agents. Mrs. Russell visited a hospital in the city of Aden, where she met Yassin, a 7-month-old boy, and his mother, Sabra, for whom life has become a struggle for survival. Sabra would tell Mrs. Russell, quote, "Thousands of children have lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands more remain at risk of death from preventable diseases or starvation," end quote. During her visit, Mrs. Russell launched UNICEF's $10.3 billion of humanitarian action for children appeal to provide water, sanitation, nutrition, education, health, and protection services to children worldwide affected by conflict and disasters. Yemen remains one of the world's most pressing humanitarian situations. More than 23.4 million people, to 3/4 of the population, require assistance and protection. More than half are children. UNICEF estimated that 2.32 million youngsters are acutely malnourished, including nearly 540,000 under 5 years of age who are suffering from severe acute malnutrition. More than 17.8 million Yemenis lack access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene services, while the country's health system has been extremely fragile for years. More than 11,000 boys and girls have been killed or injured in the war in Yemen, an average of 4 a day since fighting escalated in 2015, though the number is likely to be far higher, says the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF. And that's the end of the latest news, and now my thoughts. With the latest prescient conditions happening in the capital of Sana'a and towns like Aden, and the amount of displacement, which is now coming on 5 million people, and an incomprehensible number, and with the death toll rising to 700,000, we could say that this is by far the most prescient issue on the planet. Yet it continues to be one of the most underreported conflicts in the world. And I think the reason why is simple. Nobody cares about the plight of Muslims. And when you have a Muslim minority such as the Shia or Alawites or Shiites, Houthis, and even people from non-Arabic backgrounds like Persians, nobody cares about their plight. And when it comes to a one-sided foreign policy from the United States, well, one needs to look at the generational commitments from numerous political divisions, whether it be Republican or Democrat, toward the Gulf. Why is this? It is so that we could regulate the oil and so that other powerful countries like Great Britain, like Russia or China, which the Saudi Arabians themselves know full well that they can always side with. This is the reason why the attacks of September 11, 2001 are not fully investigated. This is the reason why the United States, whether it be the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Bush or Obama administrations, doesn't matter. Their allegiance is not toward the people, it's toward their interests. And when you have a number of documents and files which could prove that the Saudi kingdom were funding the hijackers of September 11, 2001, and the United States continues to cover up their involvement by using the FBI, one has to wonder why you continue to show support to a government that doesn't have your best interests. Now, when it goes back to Yemen, this conflict, which is now 7 years old, will predate the conflict in Ukraine. I could see the Ukraine conflict coming to an end before I could see the Yemen conflict coming to an end. And that's because Iran and Lebanon, as well as the broken country of Syria, will continue their fight justifiably against the Gulf, the corrupt Gulf monarchies. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, who are all in conjunction with the evils of this world, the U.S. government and Israel. The environmental impacts that are happening in this country from its water infrastructure, land infrastructure, which are totally decimated to the north, which the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa at UNICEF, Geert Kapelaar, has explained that the fuel shortages in Yemen have deepened the water and health crisis. And when you have water pumping stations in Yemen, which have been jeopardized as they are quickly running out of fuel for approximately over 5 million people, and you have the international community at large, which has been working closely with the people of Yemen, but they're limited to help them because of the water crisis that is happening in the country. And when you don't have water and you don't have diesel or fuel, you can't have these health agencies come and give the basic necessities to these people, especially children, which is the reason why I read that report from UNICEF, because I find that to be highly important. And to show the nefarious issues relating to both sides, the water resources have been used by both sides during the war as a tactic during this 7-year conflict. And unlike other countries in the Middle East, Yemen has no rivers to depend on for water resources. And according to a report by Global Majority e-Journal, dated December 6, 2016, I will read you the quote, Yemen has no rivers to depend on for water resources. In 2017, 250 to 600 people of the Taiz population of which 654,330 people were served by public water supply networks. As a result of the ongoing conflict, non-governmental organizations have struggled to reach the sanitation facilities due to security issues. And that's basically because Saudi and Gulf people are bombing these people. Since the area bombardment, Taiz has been left in a critical situation as the critical and current water production is not sufficient for the entire population of over 654,000 people, end quote. So when you have people trying to reach the Houthis population, and we're talking about not the government, we're talking about the common people, and you have Saudi alliances and their coalition bombing these roadways and so that in bridges, so these trucks from non-government organizations trying to help the most vulnerable, which are the elderly and children, that is a war crime, according to the Rome statutes. And what does the United States do? Nothing. And when you have people like Bernie Sanders, who basically promises an end to the conflict, but does nothing to stop or interfere with the conflict, in which he had votes in the House and didn't manage to hold a vote count against the Biden administration's cruel diplomacy regarding this matter. So much for the progressives here. And so that is the latest news. I'm hoping for an end to the conflict as it affects the most vulnerable, the elderly and children, just like all war does. And that's why war must be opposed at all costs. And I have to thank people like Dave DeCamp, Kyle Anzalone, and Will Porter and Scott Horton, and Patrick McFarland and the rest at the Libertarian Institute for calling out this ghastly conflict in Yemen, as they're probably the only ones who are the most reputable people trying to save what's left of the country.